what a pleasure it is to have Tom Rinaldi here at Politics and Prose. He'll be talking about his book. It's called The Red Bandana, A Life, a Choice, a Legacy. Tom's a journalist. He is likely a very familiar face and voice to any of you who watch ESPN, where he's been a national correspondent since 2002. He's had a very distinguished career during which he has interviewed. I was looking at the list of people he's interviewed, and it's just, the catalog of great sports figures. I just want to say I'm so glad you've interviewed my favorite, Roger Federer. By the way, I didn't ask you, are the Giants going to win tomorrow night against the Mets?
Well, as a diehard Met fan...
Oh, no. Okay, never mind. I didn't ask you. I retract and withdraw the question as a lifelong San Francisco Giants fan. So he doesn't know what he's talking about, clearly. You see him often on College Game Day, and he has won so many Emmys and other sports awards that he's, I believe, now in the double digits, if anybody is counting. The man behind the red bandana, which is the subject of his new book, was first told as a television feature 5 years ago, and I think the contours of that story are at least somewhat known. After the second plane hit the South Tower on that horrible morning of 9/11 back in 2001, a young man working on one of the upper floors helped people out of the building and then went back up to the higher floors to help those stranded above. And in saving others, he himself perished. His survivors, though, for some time afterward, could only identify him as the young man with the red bandana. This year, we mark the 15th anniversary of 9/11, and Tom has written the full story of Wells Crowther, the young man with the red bandana. It's a beautiful narrative, and in it, Tom fills in the blanks of what happened on that fateful morning, gives voice to the many people whose lives intersected with Wells Crowther's, from his childhood in Upper Nyack, New York, to his college lacrosse days, to his job on Wall Street. And he leaves readers with a renewed sense of wonder over what individual heroism actually looks like. Now, I guess one question might be, why is a sports writer writing this book? And Tom can explain how he ended up doing it, but I actually think he's the perfect person to write it. After all, if you really stop and think about it, the best sports writing is really about giving readers a window on the human condition, a chance to see how people respond to success and adversity, to tensions and pressures that we seldom experience in our daily lives. And that's exactly what Tom has accomplished in telling this incredible story. I am sure you're going to find this book moving and inspiring in ways that you can't imagine. So please join me in welcoming Tom Rinaldi to Politics and Prose.
If it were up to me, I would like to stand in front of the lectern, but I know that the shop Politics and Prose records this, so I'll stay back here for the amplification. Let me begin first just with the most important thing I can say all night, and that's thank you. It's an incredible honor to join the all-star roster that has given signings and given readings here at Politics and Prose, and I'm very grateful to you for taking some time out from your busy lives to spend a few minutes here and learn about the man in the red bandana. So thank you very much. I want to start out by doing something backwards. Usually there's a reading or a discussion, and then at the end there's a Q&A. But instead I'd like to sort of start with the Q. Because at the center of this book is really a question. And here's the thing. It's not optional. The question is headed toward each and every one of us in this room right now. We just don't know when it's going to present itself in full to us, what its timing is, where we'll be, what we'll be thinking or doing, what the shape of our lives will be when it arrives. But make no mistake, it's going to arrive. And when it does, each of us will have to author an answer as best we can. At the center of this story, which is rooted in 9/11, is this question. I wanted to begin by reading to you an exploration of this question, which applies to every one of us in the room. grab my glasses here. What would you do in the last hour of your life? Where would you be? What would it look like? Who would remember it? If you could know, would you want to? Would you receive that knowledge with dread or accept it with grace? Would there be a peace to be gained or one already granted? If you understood the mortal clock, what would you trade to gain another hour and then another after that? What prayer would you recite? What deal would you make? What promise would you offer for this not to be the end? Look upon the common fears of what your final hour might be. Take the typical conditions and likely circumstances. You know them, you've seen them, you've lost others to them. The ebbing mind or failing body, the loss of family and lack of purpose, the fact of pain or the regimen of medicines, in a home not your own, in the prisons of old age, receiving the full force of its sentencing. There might be a mercy in the dulling of your intellect. After 7 or 8 or 9 decades, maybe the final hour feels like reward. But imagine it's sooner. It's an instant from now. One blink from current. It's the line after the line you're reading. The decades haven't stacked like woods for the winter. The years haven't collected in enough albums. You haven't reached any golden age or twilight time. You're not winding down or scaling back, not going gray or getting slow. You're not there yet. You're not close. You're not old. For you, legacy is a distant and irrelevant word. It's for obituaries and sports columns. You're 24. You're ready. You're young. The hours are yours until the last one arrives. If you knew this might be that time, this could be the end, this may be the very last hour you have, what would you do? And what if the hour, with all its horror and loss, its panic and shock, still somehow gave you a choice? To fly from risk, to escape, to live. What would you do then in the last hour of your life? At the center of this story is a choice that a man made at 24 years old about what he would do in that final hour. Each of us has our own 9/11 story who is old enough to remember it. But think of two things now for a second. Our niece is 20 years old. Our son, 12. Our daughter, 9. I'll focus on our niece for just a second. She's a student at Villanova. When I asked her about 9/11, she told me she was in kindergarten. The word that leapt out at me wasn't kindergarten. It was the next sentence that she said. Really, Uncle Tom, it's something I learned about more than lived through. 20 years old. 2 years away from the definition of a generation. That's how close we are to a generation now having grown up with 9/11 as something learned about more than lived through. So 9/11 may be at the center of this story, but then there's that question of what would you do? One thing Lissa suggested to me was, in a way, to tell you about the story, but not give it all away. Here's the magic of stories. You can't really ever give them all away because everyone interprets the story differently, hears it differently, harvests its meaning in a new way, just as each and every one of us had a different experience who was old enough to reconcile the meaning of 9/11. The reason that since I met Allison and Jeff 5 years ago, that I carry that every day, suit, jeans, shorts, every day, is so that some part of me may be able to answer my own question with a fraction of the valor and the courage and the consideration that this young man did. Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal, writing about the book, wrote a beautiful line. And we've been lucky. The book's been very well received. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list the last 2 weeks, and that's meant a great deal to Allison and Jeff. But Peggy Noonan asked Allison a question I never did when she interviewed her. How do you make a hero? The reason I didn't ask Allison is because I knew, or at least I thought I did, what her response would be. And I think Peggy discovered that response. That Allison was too embarrassed to answer. And she did not think it was her place. The first part of the book traces where character might form and come from, how it's nurtured, where it's cultivated, what a family does, what a sports team does, what a coach does, what a local firehouse does around the corner. The middle of the book is 9/11 through the lens of one life lost and the lives saved. But the third part of the book is about this natural, unexpected, wonderful spread of legacy based in this one clue. For without this, Jeff and Allison would not know the answer to what their son did in his final hour. I want to read to you, if I could, if you'll indulge me, 2 other short passages. And again, for those old enough, I'd like you to think about where you were. Where you were that morning of brilliant blue in the northeast of the United States. And then I want you to think about a different passage of time. 9:59 a.m., 56 minutes after Flight 175 hit the South Tower. Collapse. The South Tower's disintegration took 10 seconds. Is that the time it takes to read the last 3 lines? To clear a dish from the table? To enter a daydream at the traffic light? To pick something to wear today? To watch a tee shot land? To address an envelope? To order off the menu? To mix a drink, to beat an egg, to lace up a shoe, to back out of the driveway, to walk out of church. It took 10 seconds for the tower's 750 million tons of heavy steel and concrete to drop, erased from the skyline, a sudden phantom. The energy released was an enormous bomb, creating dust storms and debris fields. And those are the images that we see over and over of 2 towers falling. But I'm going to take you inside a different space. Chuck Platts was Wells Crowther's roommate at the time. This is September 12th. This is Chuck Platts in a 2-room apartment in the West Village in New York City, trying to find the courage to do what would seem to be the simplest thing in the world. To walk into his roommate's bedroom. The next day, Wednesday, Chuck Platts breathed deeply, paused, and walked into Wells' bedroom for the first time. Platts was 23 years old. The most significant loss he'd experienced in his life was the death of his grandfather when he was 7. No one else he'd known well had died. He looked down at the threshold, the saddle of wood on the floor between the hallway and the room. He paused. Outside, where streets had been blocked off and an emergency force mobilized, where a smoldering pile complicated with bodies rose 150 feet in the air, where the small city of the Twin Towers had populated the sky a day before, where families and friends were beginning to post signs of their missing loved ones on every flat surface they could find. Boy, don't we remember that. Where a city ever boastful of its imperviousness and its clout had been pierced and its psyche shaken. Outside there were millions of souls, all grappling alone and together with anger and pain, doubt and fear. Inside apartment 19, there was stillness, where yesterday there was luminous motion. The room was proof, silent, implacable. The glass of water was still on the dresser. The dry cleaning receipts for his suits were still pinned underneath a wooden loon he used as a paperweight. The dent from Wells' head was still there in the pillow. In the silence, Platts heard the first echoes of his friend's life. Nothing definite had emerged as to his fate. No authority had decreed his end. No official had called or come by. But in his heart, Platts understood. He knew. He was not beyond denial. He had occupied the same space and breathed the same air his friend did the day before. That held more than proximity. The space contained a truth. He could hear Wells walking out the door, the sound forever tracked in his mind. The vacancy of the room would stay with him for years to come. Even today, I take a second to look around my room when I'm leaving for the day, he said, more than a decade later. Maybe I tidy up the bed or I clean things up. Not that I'm thinking I'm not coming back. It's just this little reminder in the back of my head of what it was like to walk into his room, of what it looked like, just the way it was when he walked out the door that day. I find myself doing little things like closing the closet door, fixing up the bed, putting the remote on the back table. I feel like I'm doing them because of the memory of walking into his room and seeing it, just as he left it. He left as if he was coming back. I think maybe in some ways, I try to make the rooms look neat when I leave. For him. How do you make a hero? The book doesn't offer any definitive answer. Instead, it traces a young life of an athlete and volunteer fireman, of somebody bullied when he was young because he was small, of somebody who broke his hand in a college fight because he thought a bully was picking on someone else, of someone who decided in bitter cold after a freak ice storm to skate naked behind his dorm, only to have his roommates lock the door when he tried to get back in. It's not hagiography. It's an American life. And at a time, and Lissa referred to it, put your seatbelt on, of such division and discord in our country, for those who remember it, the unity that we felt as a people, and where we are now, this is a slim book, perhaps offering some common ground of our character and our courage and our valor when the question reaches us. Allison and Jeff, They were determined to make good from loss. It's not easy. The book discusses those successes and those failures, a parent's unique heartbreak, and the enormity of their pride when the president, in opening the 9/11 Museum in the spring of 2014, chose to mention one name out of 2,977 souls who perished. One. He mentioned this name. Not because it's unique, but because it's universal. Not because it's separate, but because it's part of the collective. My family and my friends asked me as I was writing the book, does it end in an inspiring or hopeful way, or with a note of loss? When someone asks you that, you know the answer they want to hear. It's not really an earnest question. And my answer was always the same. It ends in both ways. I'm very grateful for you coming tonight and indulging me with your attention and your attendance. And again, I'm honored to be here at Politics and Prose. Thank you guys very much. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you for not just this is amazing, but for all of your reporting over the years. I've watched you since I was in high school, and thank you.
That makes me feel very, very old.
Yeah.
And I am, so I deserve it.
But I did see the presentation you did for ESPN before you did this, and
Right.
I know 30 for 30, which I think is the best documentary film series out there today.
We
on
appreciate
any
that
subject.
very much. That's very kind.
I have to say, is this going to be turned into a full-length 30 for 30 presentation?
This story was originally presented in 2011, and even though we were indulged with 13 and a half minutes of national television time on ESPN in my day job, obviously 200 pages is a much more fuller treatment and a different kind of narrative. I guess the humblest way to respond to that is there have been some people certainly who have reached out from different venues, and we're grateful for all of that interest, and we'll see what takes shape. But I appreciate you asking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So you talk about the central question of what makes a hero, and you spoke about character and legacy. Did you feel like you set out knowing those were the themes you were exploring, or did anything present itself to you in the research, in speaking to different people throughout?
There are any number of experiences in our lives which can't be approximated. You can't approximate the first day of kindergarten. You can't approximate a wedding day, the birth of your child. And not to put this on that level, but you cannot approximate writing your first book. So it was a process I sort of learned by doing. And I wrote the book very much out of sequence based on what reporting I had at any given time. I think I always knew I was drawn to the story for those themes, but did not know they would present themselves, hopefully, through a showing more than a telling. But those themes are certainly very strong, and I think that's what drew the president to them. That's what's drawn schools across the country to use his story as the basis of a character education curriculum. I think those themes are evident, but they're in the details. Again, in the details of an imperfect life, which ultimately had an indelible answer to that question. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, thanks for being here. I'm really glad I got off my back and came here.
Thank you for the effort.
A very prosaic question in a way. Did you get a chance to talk to any of the people that he did save? And are any of them included in the book as far as their narrative?
Great question. They are included, 2 in particular, in 2 separate groups, which is how we know Wells didn't just save one group and then go to his own safety, but instead, as Lissa referred to, and as the book explores, makes this choice to go back up the stairs and do it again. In that first group is a woman named Ling Young. And when I read aloud to Allison, one of her reactions that struck me and really stunned me, there is a fairly, I don't know, is it fair to characterize it, Lissa, as graphic? There's certainly a very strong level of detail as to what was happening on the 78th floor of the South Tower. Ling, her injuries, the extent of her body being burned, the shock she was in, all of these things are depicted in the book. But, and I'll leave it to those of you who read the story, but there's a miraculous moment when Ling is presented for the first time with Wells' photograph, not knowing ever the identity prior to that moment of the man who had saved her life. Her son was sent a photo. I won't say any more, but her reaction is an indelible moment, certainly in her life, and it's a key to the narrative. Judy Ween is another woman who he saved, whose story is told in the book as well. There's also a scene where survivors and Wells' parents meet at Wells' home. And you can imagine what that scene was like. And it's a fascinating decision how they end that meeting, where they go, and what they decide to do, also in the book. Thanks for that question.
And the book.
Yes, sir.
He's obviously waiting.
No, go right ahead.
Oh, thank you.
What is your name?
Bernard.
Bernard.
While I was listening, I noticed you had a blue bandana in the front pocket of your jacket.
I do. I have bandanas in different colors. I did not wear a red bandana here. Full disclosure, I arrived to you having worked my day job at the memorial service, the public memorial for Arnold Palmer today. I was fortunate enough to be both a reporter there and an invited guest into the Basilica. And sometimes at events like that, while I didn't dress in the darkest shades, brighter shades sometimes don't seem to fit occasions like that. So I wore a blue bandana instead. Arnold Palmer was an icon, a wonderful man, and a friend to nearly everybody that he met. That's why, Bernard. But thank you. Thank you for your question.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your inspiring story. Could you talk a little bit about the father-son relationship?
There's a sound that Jeff Crowther would make when he would go to games and watch his son play. Wells idolized his father, became a volunteer firefighter because his dad was a firefighter. Ultimately, went into banking because his dad was a banker. And they had an incredibly close relationship. As proof, we all know we get to a certain age, son or daughter, and some of the things we found so wonderful about our parents suddenly become embarrassing or mortifying. One such thing, Jeff would make a certain sound at every sports game that Wells played in. And it became kind of their code. And teammates would say to Wells, when are you going to get your old man to stop with the sound? It's so annoying. When Wells graduated from college, way up in the rafters, his parents were there, and his dad desperately wanted to get his attention so he could take a photo. 2,000 students down on the football field, and suddenly Wells turns, the picture's in the book, and looks right into the lens of his father because he makes the sound. Can anybody guess what the sound might be?
The siren of a fire hydrant.
Bang.
I knew it.
Great job, Bernard. Great job. Yes, sir.
How'd you get to meet Jeff and Allison?
Great question. When we did the television story for ESPN, that was the first time that I met them. And we actually have a personal connection because Wells, the producer of his story on television, was actually a classmate of his at Boston College and a friend who had tried for several years to convince our bosses that this was a story that we should tell. Apparently, he was right, given that the president, who we know saw the story on ESPN, was at least in some part influenced to mention him at the memorial. And I kept in touch with them ever since that time. I talked to them all the time. I texted back and forth with Allison today. So I'm in regular touch with them all the time. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Tom. Thanks so much. I'm a big fan of your work.
That's very kind. Thank you.
And I was interested in what Alicia said earlier about how, as a sports writer, in some ways you're uniquely positioned to write such a story. And I just found out about the book a few days ago, and I saw that you were speaking here, and I was thinking, oh, what sports book did you write about? And then when I started reading about it, and then hearing you today, I mean, I can see that you have a unique storytelling style. And so I was wondering, the life of a sports reporter, the life of a sports writer, I think it has some unique characteristics, skills, and experience that are different from sort of your normal political reporter, say. And I just wondering, how did you channel that sort of experience as a sports reporter and sort of bring those skills to bear in writing this book? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. In my day job, for those who don't know, I do 5 things for ESPN. I cover college football, not very resonant in this place right now, I understand that, nor in the Northeast for that matter. Maryland down, I get it. I cover tennis, and I say this with the deepest respect to Lissa, but I know Federer very well.
Really lucky man.
I cover golf, but the biggest thing that I do, the main thing that I do, is I do human interest stories across all sport, and the 5th thing is whatever they tell me to do. Those are the things I do. But what I would answer that question by saying a story is a story. Whether it happens in a sporting venue, a political venue, a story is a story. And those fundamentals, I think, present. And I know that in what I've done, I've identified, at least for me, the 2 things I find most compelling. And I'm honored to be able, and privileged to be able, to cover them at times. One is greatness. Greatness is compelling. And it's not always glorious. Sometimes it's dressed as a villain. Sometimes it's dressed with thorns on the outside. But greatness is compelling. And the other is the line between living and dying. A lot of the stories that I've done on ESPN touch on one or the other, but no story for me more deeply than this one. So thank you for your question. Yes, ma'am.
So thank you so much for telling this story. I read the book, and reading it I thought was a very kind of emotional experience too.
Thank you for reading it.
Yeah, thank you. And as I was reading it, I was thinking writing it must have been very emotional and had me wondering, how did this affect you? Must have been very, I think, difficult, to learn some of these things. And so yeah, how did it sort of affect you writing it?
Thanks very much for your question. I'm I'm first generation college. I'm the son of a stonemason, and my mom was a bank teller. My dad passed away a few years ago. We grew up I was born in Brooklyn, eventually moved to Jersey in a house that my father built with his father. I wrote the book in the house that my father built. The first listener/reader of all the pages was my mother. The most emotional thing for me was to see my mother react to some of the passages that you might imagine would touch her. Those passages about Allison in particular. And my mother is a straight shooter. She's from Brooklyn. So there were passages, I'll just put it to you this way, that certainly never came close to making it in. And my mother wields the verbal version of the red pen. When she gives you this look, you know you've strayed. You're on the wrong track. And she gave me that look plenty. But those are probably among the most emotional moments. Of course, the moment, as I described earlier with Allison and Jeff, is something I'll never, ever forget. Thank you for reading it. Yes, sir.
Tom, hi. Thank you again for tonight. I want to echo the thanks of this group. It's really been an inspirational night. Like the last person who asked the question, I hadn't heard about this book other than one of the teachers at the Woods Academy, Chris Maloney, who has gathered a lot of us here this evening.
Chris, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
My question is, as an aspiring author, I had a very close friend at Boston College, died tragically about 5 years ago. And as part of that process, I was inspired at one specific moment where I thought, I have to write about this, and I have to give this book, much like you gave your book to Allison and Jeff at that table.
Right.
And so it was this awakening, this moment. Was there a moment for you when you decided that this was a cause, this was a person, this was a special event that you really had to grasp and write about?
What a wonderful question. And I wish you luck.
Thank you.
Writing is, I'm sure Alyssa will tell you, every writer that she's had will tell you, it's one word after the next word. Mm-hmm. It's one sentence after the next sentence. It's simply a disciplined, determined effort. Mm-hmm. I know there are Tom Wolfes out there who can sit down and seem to conjure something out of the air. But I also know Catcher in the Rye took 10 years to write.
Wow.
So there's an example. When I felt it was a mission, I think as soon as we told the story on television and we felt that great connection to Allison and Jeff, but we were astounded at ESPN. I mean astounded at the reaction to the television version. Wow. We tell stories that a lot of times you never know what will land and what won't land. But we heard from people we just don't hear from on this particular story. Mm-hmm. The highest reaches of government. We heard from people connected to the Supreme Court. We heard from just people who we don't typically hear from. And I also know that, and I touched on this already, but while it is not the rendering of a saint, it's a common life that did something deeply uncommon. Mm-hmm. There's good in that. And I think some of the mission was, without sounding, I know this sounds horribly didactic, but to humbly try to put a little bit of good in the world through this story was its own mission. Mm-hmm. I don't know that we succeeded, but we tried.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question.
Tom, thank you again for being here, and
thanks
really
for coming.
Appreciate the great work. I'm very envious of all the individuals that you get to talk to in your line of work. So,
sure.
But job well done. My question is really two-pronged. How have the challenges that you faced in your career to date prepared you to either take on this story or take on the book itself? And I guess the follow-up to that is, how were you not prepared to take on the story or the book itself?
What a great question. Thank you, and thank you for coming. I'll answer the second part first, and I'll just say that I was completely ill-prepared to do this. As I said, there's some experiences you cannot approximate. I think one proof of that was I had a bedrock level of doubt that I could do this. I mean, bedrock. My wife, the seating order may change, but for me, she's 3 seats from Jesus. The fact that she hung in there with me through my endless doubt, she's the greatest, period. And if she were here, she'd turn red and everything else, but she'd know it's true. All right. I just had grave doubt that I could do it, and I still doubt that I've really lived up to the story. I've done my best to render it the best I could, but I still don't know that it equals the telling that it deserves, being honest with you. If I could leave everybody with one last thing to the first part of your question, what prepares you? In telling these human interest stories, and I've told so many, I go back to one answer that someone gave me, I think 18 years ago now. I was doing a story about a football player at Boise State, which has become a significant college football program, but years ago really had to build itself up from a very modest standing. And the first great recruit that they got was an offensive lineman named Reyna from California. Notre Dame and Michigan put on the full press to get this hulk of a young man. And he chose Boise State. Dirk Cutter, at the time, who's now an NFL coach, was the coach of Boise State. And he's thinking, Dirk Cutter, we're going to get rolling. This is going to start it for us. 5-star recruit. Everybody wants this kid. We got him. He chose bus. The second or third scrimmage of fall camp, he gets blocked, falls to the turf, hits his head, gets up, comes over to the bench, and slumps over. He loses consciousness. Cutter calls his mother in California. You need to come up. She comes and sits vigil for 7 days in the hospital. He never regains consciousness and he dies. There are many different peregrinations to the story, but I'm just going to share one with you. The simplest question is often the hardest to answer. And I find that few reporters ask the simple question. Here's a question so simple but devastating in its simplicity that I've asked many times. The first time I ever asked it was to Mrs. Reyna. What made it real? She said that the day that his headstone arrived, she walked to the plot, she saw it set, and she looked at it and something struck her. And this is a thought which is not original, yet I had never heard it before. She said, I looked at the stone and thought of my son, and I saw only 3 things. His name, 2 dates, and a hyphen, a dash. And suddenly she said to me, and I realized that that dash is all you get. And I became determined from the time I left that cemetery that every day I would pick up my chisel and I would do my best to carve my dash and my hyphen in that stone every day for the rest of my life to honor him. And she went straight from there to Boise and asked if she could address the team. And she told them, I don't want anyone to ever play with fear. This is not going to happen to you. It happened to my son, and it won't happen to you. Play fearlessly as he would want you to. And of course, in the sports telling of the story, they were picked preseason to finish dead last, and they won their first conference title. Pick up your chisel and carve your hyphen every day. When people tell you things like that, you feel compelled to share stories. And I'm a constant witness, and I'll constantly marvel at the strength of what we bear. Thanks for the question. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Oh, we have one more. I'm sorry.
One last question.
I'm probably repeating a question, but what really encouraged you to write the book?
It's a great question. Nobody asked it. It's not a repetition. And I would say, truthfully, 3 things were my prime encouragements. My wife, son, and daughter. I told them it was going to take a lot of time to write it, and I already missed a lot of time in their lives traveling for my job. And at the time, our daughter, how old are you?
10.
Okay. At the time, our daughter now is 9. At the time, she was 7. And she looked at me, and she said in a sentence I'll never forget, "You have to write it. There's no choice." That was my chief encouragement.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so much. Tom will be up here if you have a book and would like it signed. We have copies up at the front.